The Supreme Court is set to hear arguments on something very important to the Affordable Care Act, or ObamaCare as some call it, on Wednesday. At issue, plaintiffs say the act allows subsidies that help people to afford health insurance only go to states that have created their own insurance exchanges, not those that rely on the federal marketplace. But guess what? There are a lot of states that didn't set up their own exchanges, so it's a big deal. Let's bring in our legal panel. Michael Cannon is the Cato Institute's Director of Health Policy Studies, and Elizabeth Wydra is the Constitutional Accountability Center's Chief Counsel. Good to have you both here.
Great to be here, Shannon.
All right, so this has to do with the fact that right now there are 37 states that didn't set up their own exchanges, but the IRS extended these subsidies, which help people to afford health insurance under the ACA. Elizabeth, how critical is this case Wednesday to the health of the overall act?
It's extremely critical. The availability of tax credits to every American who needs them across the country is a crucial part of the Affordable Care Act. And without it, the act simply can't function. That's why it's so preposterous to think that Congress would have written the law in the way that the challengers say it did. And no one thought that that's the way the law worked. Not the members of Congress who wrote it, the state officials who implemented it, not even Scott Walker, who might be the next Republican presidential candidate, thought that. He built his Wisconsin program based on the assumption that tax credits on federally facilitated exchanges would be available.
Well, and Michael, we have Jonathan Gruber, who some call, although he downplays it, some call him the architect of Obamacare. We have him on tape numerous times saying these states don't get these subsidies, or the taxpayers in those states don't get the subsidies if the exchanges aren't set up. He now says that's taken out of context. It's a mistake. What say you?
Well, what this case is really about is millions of Americans like Kevin Pace. Kevin is a musician. He's a professor of music in Virginia. And two lower courts have found that the IRS illegally imposed Obamacare's mandates on his employer. And as a result, he took a hit to his income of $8,000. We expect the Supreme Court to agree with those two lower courts and list those illegal taxes off of tens of millions of Americans. That's what's at stake in this case.
I see you chomping at the bit.
I'm happy to talk about the real people involved in this case, and I would think about the real people who are going to lose their health insurance and the people who will actually die. Public health teams have quantified the number of people who will lose their lives if they lose these tax credits, which allow them to access health insurance. That's what's really at stake.
Michael,
here.
We are talking about millions of people who will be impacted by this, and Elizabeth even said it could be disastrous for the law itself. So how much do you think that will weigh into the court's consideration here?
Well, I don't think that it should. What Elizabeth is saying is that Obamacare doesn't work without illegal taxes. What that means is that Obamacare doesn't work, and that's really an argument for repealing the law.
Okay, I see you wincing at that, because that's maybe not the characterization that you would make of what you're saying.
No, not at all. It's, you have this three-part of the statute of which providing tax credits to Americans who need help purchasing health insurance is a crucial part of it. And you need all three of them together to work. And the statute has already been upheld as constitutional by the Supreme Court. And this is just another political attempt to get rid of the law inappropriately pushed through the courts.
How much do you think, Michael, that the court will give deference to the IRS as it has interpreted the statute, as it understands it, in providing these subsidies? Because, the language says the subsidies go where state exchanges have been set up. And so there are those who will argue for that very plain, segment by itself, and then others, like Elizabeth, who say that's never how the law was intended to work. Is it that those who put together the law expected that all the states would set up their exchanges and there would be great incentives for them to do so, and they didn't calculate the potential backlash for states that didn't?
If the statute is perfectly clear, these subsidies and these taxes are only authorized, quote, through an exchange established by the state. And if we say that members of Congress didn't expect the law to work that way, well, we're just admitting that members of Congress didn't read the law before they passed it. They passed it hastily, and now they're having buyer's remorse. It turns out that supporters of Obamacare don't like Obamacare any more than the rest of the country does.
I want to ask you both, who do you think is your critical justice that you have to get here? There's a lot of speculation about Kennedy. There's a lot of speculation about the Chief Justice. Who would you be targeting if you're making these arguments?
Well, all of the justices, including conservatives like Scalia and Thomas and Chief Justice Roberts, have said that you read a statute in its entirety, in its context. You don't take 4 words in isolation and only read those. You could take 4 words out of Moby Dick and say it's a whale-watching Sunday cruise, but you'd get an F on that book report in grade school.
Quick final word, Michael.
If this were about anything but Obamacare, it would be 9-0 for the plaintiffs. What the government is arguing is that the court should cut the IRS some slack. When was the last time the IRS ever cut you some slack?
Well, you know what? I don't think we're going to have any agreement between the two of you, other than this is going to be a very interesting case.
Indeed.
All right, they'll argue it Wednesday. We should have a decision by the end of June. Thank you both for coming in.
Thank you, Shannon.